Thank you for tuning in to the Street Writer Podcast. My name is Noah, aka Big Mex, and on this series we're talking about the history of the brawler. So the year, it's just the early 90s, and two of the biggest companies in the world are actually going to do battle and have audiences determine who really is the king of the brawling genre. So let's get started. Konami came out swinging in 1991. Their first licensed title of that year was considered by many longtime Simpsons fans as the best video game based on the animated series. I would be inclined to agree with them. Konami approached the series in the completely opposite direction than Data East did with Captain America and the Avengers. Yeah, I'm still salty about that, and I'm going to keep bringing it up. Anyhow, The Simpsons. So the show was just beginning to gain momentum. It was not the pop culture juggernaut that it became a few years later. Konami did not have to go out of their way to ensure it received any special treatment. Instead of simply licensing the series and throwing some random game together, or worse yet, ignoring the important Simpsons canon, Konami did a great deal of research and stayed completely true to the source material. They went so far as to capture the early artistic style of the creator Matt Groening, whose fingerprints were all over the earliest seasons. Konami had applied a greater level of detail even than when they released the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game. And that was impressive because at that point there was still not a tremendous amount of Simpsons animated material to draw from. The game revolved around the kidnapping of Maggie Simpson by Mr. Burns. The Simpsons clan traversed the known Springfield universe to get her back, including a stop-off at Moe's Tavern, the Springfield Discount Cemetery, Channel 6, and the nuclear power plant. The game was filled with details pulled right from the show, and plenty of hidden gags. Players were tempted to go near doors, only to have them swing open and flatten the heroes. The same gag had been featured in Crime Fighters, also by Konami a year before. Other gags involved not moving the joystick and watching the hidden animations and word balloons appear over the characters. To break up the monotony, mini games were placed in between the levels. As far as brawling titles went, the Simpsons game had it all. Wave after wave of unique rivals, mostly goons hired by Mr. Burns, but also the rabbit characters from Groening's Bongo comics, wrestlers, robots, and ninjas as well. There were also secret double team attacks that players could do. So if two characters stood side by side, and it didn't matter who, Marge and Homer, Bart and Lisa, Lisa and Marge, Bart and Homer. So it didn't matter which two. If they stood side by side, and if the players didn't move the controls, then the two characters would team up and do damage to the opponents without getting hurt themselves. So Homer could throw Bart at opponents, Marge and Homer could roll over opponents, and Bart and Lisa, they were probably my favorite. They would hold hands and then they just run over opponents while screaming their lungs out. So that was easily my favorite. The animation was great. Plenty of nuances that followed the style of the show and didn't appear to have been designed or programmed by the Japanese. Capcom was trying a multi-tiered approach to the brawler that year. They tried out different genres and different artistic styles for the brawler, two of which were medieval titles that came out the same year. So King of Dragons was a brawler with RPG elements. Players could choose from one of several classes, including a traditional elf, wizard, and dwarf. Characters fought off waves of orcs, goblins, dragons, and other fantasy monsters. The characters had weapons that could be upgraded by collecting treasures and defeating opponents. This meant for stronger attacks and vitality through the course of the game. These same elements were explored in the sister title, Knights of the Round. Knights of the Round was a fantasy brawler as well. Instead of 5 character classes, There were three main characters to choose from: King Arthur, Lancelot, and Percival. They and their opponents were based on the legendary figures. The sprites were slightly larger than those from King of Dragons and more detailed. As the characters progressed and gained levels and experience, their weapons and armors reflected those changes. If a player went from beginning to end, then they would have earned the best possible version of their weapons or armor. If a player decided to join a game in progress, then they would begin at level 1 weapons and armor. The game offered no shortcuts to eager cheaters. Knights of the Round and King of Dragons were not Capcom's first attempt at sword and sorcery action games. A year prior, they had released Magic Sword. It was a 2D adventure game that had many of the same elements featured in both brawlers. Characters could earn a weapon, armor, and magic upgrades. They could even earn sidekicks to help with battles, and those sidekicks could be upgraded as well. The three games were very fun to play and offered a unique take on the fantasy brawler. They were all far enough removed from Golden Axe as to not draw immediate comparisons, yet they were still accessible. The games worked in the arcade and were able to be ported to the Super Nintendo home console pretty quickly because they lacked the complexity or large sprites featured in the Simpsons arcade game. Capcom would see a tremendous potential in keeping their arcade efforts and home versions almost identical. In many cases, they could charge people twice for playing the same game. Both Konami and Capcom were experimenting with animation techniques and visual stylization in 1991. Both put forward games that featured original characters with cartoon elements. Captain Commando, which as far as I know was the only game to feature the actual company mascot. So the captain was joined by a trio of really odd archetypes. There was an alien mummy called Mac the Knife, a futuristic ninja called Ginzu, and a robot piloting a baby called Babyhead. The characters were silly and their opponents were over the top. The game was like a send-up of the old superhero shows where a handful of heroes fought against impossible odds to save the planet. The game was fun, but featured elements that were reminiscent of things explored by Konami the previous year. In one part of the game, the main characters could jump onto robot suits and set their opponents on fire. It was similar to the robot suit that players could use against the Alien Queen at the end of Konami's Aliens. Also, a portion of the Captain Commando game featured the characters flying over oceans on rocket-powered hoverboards. This was not unlike the skateboard mechanic used in Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle game. Konami did not just meet the challenge laid out by Capcom, they exceeded it in many regards. The Simpsons was a runaway hit in the arcade. Their other brawler was not as popular, but it was equally fun. Sunset Riders was a brawling interpretation of the Wild West. It featured 4 generic heroes, 2 of which fought with pistols, and 2 of which fought with rifles. The 4 were in search of outlaws and their bounties. The characters could walk along frontier towns, forests, and trails. In some parts of the game, they could even climb hand over hand on suspended rope bridges. Some of the levels featured the cast on horseback, chasing down opponents. The game was filled with as many hidden animations, if not more, than The Simpsons. Players that happened to pass in front of an open door could run into the room and get kissed by a girl for extra health. The characters could also interact with the environment. They could shoot ropes, holding down barrels, and drop those onto opponents. Take a hold of Gatling guns and shoot up the fortifications, and swing on chandeliers while shooting at bosses inside a saloon. Sunset Riders was not the first attempt for Konami to get into the Western. In 1986, they released a game called Iron Horse, which played somewhere in between a brawler and Castlevania, which they also created. Iron Horse was set entirely within a stolen train, and the main character had to defeat wave after wave of opponents as he ran towards the engine. Iron Horse was nothing special, especially when compared to Sunset Riders. The game was a caricature of the Wild West, further distilled by Japanese anime aesthetics. Despite being entirely based on gunplay, the title was cartoony and lighthearted. This game was definitely not politically correct. Good guy and bad guy archetypes were brightly painted interpretations of history. The Mexican character, for example, Cormano, he wore a pink sombrero and a pink poncho. Saloon girls entertained our heroes with a flirty can-can. In the opening credits, the hero Billy could clearly be seen smoking a cigarette, and the Native American boss character, Chief Scalpum, and his tribe were as stereotypical as the studio could get. Needless to say, a game like this would never have been released by a US developer. Remember that the Japanese and most other Asian countries do not share the same cultural perceptions. Many countries on the other side of the Pacific did not have a civil rights movement. They did not change policy or social customs because of the minority. What some people in the USA would consider stereotype, they might consider entertainment. If anything, Sunset Riders was pandering to the same crowd that grew up on westerns in the USA. Despite its skewed take on the West, the game was still highly memorable and playable. The levels were familiar versions of Western locations. Characters battled scores of bandits, not only on horseback, but also while riding on top of a train or raiding a fort, or even running on top of bulls during a stampede. The levels were an amalgamation of cool movie moments that never were, just as the cast was made up of familiar faces that were all brand new. The boss fights were intense, but not outright cheap, and the music kept the familiar guitar twang throughout. In fact, there were several digitized audio files that worked well in the game, none more than the dialogue between the characters and bosses. After the very first boss, Simon Greedwell, was defeated, he took a tumble from the balcony of his business, and he said with a southern drawl,
"Marry me with my money."
That overly dramatic line would stick with me and my brothers. 20 years later, 30 years later, whenever one of us said that line, we would all laugh and wonder why there was never a Sunset Riders 2. Most brawling games rarely saw a sequel. The few ones that came out were mostly released on consoles. Double Dragon had a couple of arcade sequels which, depending on who you asked, were of diminishing quality. Konami did develop a sequel that was hands down better than the original title. Vendetta was a sequel to Crime Fighters, the 4-player brawler from 1989. The original game had the bad luck of being released the same year as Final Fight. Konami got buried by Capcom's Urban Brawler. A few years later, they came back with an updated game which met, and in some ways, topped Final Fight. Now, I don't want to say anything too outlandish because it appears that 99% of the arcade vets remember Final Fight and only 1% remember Vendetta. If Vendetta really were that great, then surely it would have been enshrined in the Arcade Hall of Fame. I don't want to offend the 99% of arcade veterans out there that really love Final Fight, but I think Vendetta deserves a spot easily in the top 10 all-time brawler list. While Crime Fighters failed in every regards to be a really good brawling game, Vendetta was a trip back to the elements that made the genre so appealing, especially to young men. So to audiences, it was a better version of Double Dragon with support for 4 players. Then they could dig deeper and find all sorts of advances to the genre. Players could punch, kick, and combo attack opponents just as they could in the other urban-based brawlers. They could also grab and strike as well as throw opponents. That was nothing new. However, the moves that the characters had in this game were unique and greatly rewarding, especially for those that played in a group. Players could sneak up behind opponents, grab them in a full Nelson, and let teammates punch them. Players could also strike opponents on the ground. Best of all, none of the 4 playable characters shared exactly the same moveset. Some of them kicked, one punched, and one dropped a knee, and even one dropped an elbow on prone opponents. Up until that point, most brawling games had characters that played fair and let gang members get up before they could be hit again. The bad guys fought dirty and the heroes never could in other games. Vendetta was a counter to that logic. If a bad guy could pull a knife or a gun on the heroes, then why should they hold back? Players could smack into opponents with a running clothesline, throw Molotov cocktails, pick up drop shotguns, and swing nail bats with reckless abandon. There was nothing more satisfying than playing in a group and experiencing the mayhem that was Vendetta, throwing opponents off of elevated platforms, hitting them with a sack of cement, and watching them go blind for a moment before following up with a sucker punch. It satiated the bloodlust of the teenage mind by allowing it to fulfill the violent fantasies that were denied in other brawlers. It predated the design and chaotic atmosphere that made my guilty pleasure State of Emergency so fun. However, it was a game that was best enjoyed with a group of players. The best mechanics in the game were dependent on having other players team up on the rival gang. Arcade players rarely ran in packs, let alone played the same game at the same time. Final Fight could be enjoyed as a solo experience or with a team. That was the balance that Konami lacked here, and why Vendetta was not as well remembered. The other reason why it might have been overlooked was because it was a retelling of the original Crime Fighters plot, except instead of kidnapping several women this time, it was just one girl that was kidnapped. The damsel in distress was starting to become a stale plot. Vendetta was a spectacle. Every level tried to outdo the last, and even the final level consisted of taking on all the bosses in a battle royale, just as in the original Crime Fighters. The gang characters were not quite typical, with the occasional masked, chubby voodoo brawler or whip-cracking dominatrix chasing down the heroes. The game even allowed players to fight off rabid Doberman pinchers, much to the chagrin of animal lovers. The bosses were typical, exaggerated gang archetypes. Leather-clad tough guys and suit-wearing kooks that could have fallen out of a comic book. Those bosses and even the heroes themselves were actually a Japanese interpretation of US pop culture. In the original Crime Fighters, the four main characters looked identical with only the color of their pants separating the brawlers. In the sequel, there were four distinct characters, members of the Cobra's gang, the black ex-boxer, Blood, wearing red mind you, the former pro wrestler Hawk, which looked just like Hulk Hogan, Boomer, the blonde karate fighter, and Sledge, the ex-military convict who looked like a white version of Mr. T. They made up the playable characters. The crew was fighting off the menace of the Dead End Gang, which did sound very intimidating, and featured characters like Buzzsaw Bravado, the Rude Bros, and their leader, Faust. It was always interesting to see how Western pop culture, or even subculture, was assimilated into gaming design. Hard rock and heavy metal had always maintained a certain level of popularity in Japan. The characters Poison, Roxy, Axel, and Sodom from Final Fight were inspired by the metal scene from the late 80s and early 90s. In Vendetta, it was a bit of US wrestling culture that took the lead. Mr. T and Hulk Hogan were old favorites from TV that had appeared in Japan following their pop explosion in the 80s. Well, Hulk Hogan had actually appeared earlier than that. A lesser-known wrestler by the name of Bruiser Brody had made quite an impression on the Japanese during his various tours. A version of this character was featured in Vendetta, dubbed the Missing Link, not to be confused with another wrestler actually called the Missing Link. The video game version was a crazed fighter, not far removed from the actual wrestler and his gimmicks. It could be argued that the brawler evolved from Japan, pandering to Western markets. Kung Fu Master and Karate Champ were groundbreaking games, but in order to appeal to the US arcade market, the publishers had to reflect the culture. Double Dragon succeeded because it was set in a pseudo-New York. Almost every successive brawler from that point was seeped in Western culture. The Simpsons, Aliens, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle were popular licenses. Sunset Riders was a takeoff on the TV Western. Even fantasy brawlers, Knights of the Round and King of Dragons, were based on Western rather than Eastern mythology. Final Fight and Vendetta were superior versions of Double Dragon with hopefully enough Western cultural references to keep gamers putting in their quarters. Both Konami and Capcom made sure that 1991 was a very good year for players. The rest of the industry would continue pushing the genre forward, releasing wave after wave of new takes on the brawler. We're going to explore these in the next episode. Thank you for sitting in on this episode. Again, my name is Noah, aka Big Mex. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast and would like to sponsor me, please visit my Patreon page. You can find me, I'm Street Rider, and consider donating every month. I do appreciate the donations, especially to my original friends that had been donating to me even when times were slow on my blog and times were slow on my recordings. I hope this series makes it up for you. Have a great day, and I'll see you on the next episode.